sprawling marble mansion echoed with emptiness despite its glittering chandeliers and polished floors. Billionaire Richard Hale, a titan of industry feared in boardrooms across the globe, carried a secret shame at home. His only son Daniel had been diagnosed with autism. Richard loved the boy fiercely but couldn't reach him. Daniel never spoke, never looked his father in the eye, and often retreated into his own world of silence and rocking motions. 7 nannies had come and gone, each leaving defeated, unable to handle the meltdowns, the resistance, the heartbreaking silence. Richard's money could buy anything except connection. On the day the 7th nanny left in tears, Richard's frustration reached its peak. "Enough!" he thundered, his voice booming through the halls. "There will be no more incompetence in my house." But his anger crumbled when he found Daniel curled in a corner, covering his ears from the noise. Guilt pierced him. He crouched, whispering, "I just want to help you, son." But Daniel didn't react. His eyes locked on the toy car spinning endlessly in his hands. Richard sank into despair, his wealth mocking him. What use was empire if he couldn't bridge the gap to his own child? Enter Maria, the new maid. A quiet woman in her 30s, she came not with impressive credentials, but with tired eyes and a calm presence. She kept to herself, cleaning quietly, humming soft tunes in Spanish under her breath. Unlike the others, she didn't try to force interaction with Daniel. She simply moved gently through the house, creating an atmosphere of peace. Richard barely noticed her at first. She was just staff, after all. But Daniel noticed. His head would tilt when she sang, his rocking slowing slightly, his gaze flicking toward her before darting away again. One afternoon, Richard returned from a crushing board meeting, shoulders heavy with stress. He dropped his briefcase and froze at the sight before him. Across the living room, Daniel, who never approached anyone willingly, was standing, wobbling uncertainly on his small feet. His eyes were fixed on Maria, who knelt on the rug, softly humming as she folded laundry. Slowly, shakily, Daniel began to walk toward her. Each step felt impossible, miraculous. Richard held his breath, afraid the moment would shatter if he moved. His empire, his billions, his pride, all melted as he whispered, "Dear God." Daniel reached Maria, tugging gently at the edge of her apron. Maria looked down, startled, then softened instantly, her hand brushing his hair. "Hola, pequeño," she whispered, her voice like balm. To Richard's utter disbelief, Daniel didn't recoil. Instead, he leaned against her, resting his head on her lap. Richard's heart clenched. His son had never sought comfort from anyone, not even him. His throat burned with tears he refused to shed. Maria met his gaze across the room, uncertain, almost apologetic, but Richard could only stare, frozen in awe. His fortress of failure had just cracked open. From that day, everything began to shift. Richard found himself watching from doorways as Daniel followed Maria around like a shadow. When she dusted shelves, he trailed behind. When she sang, he swayed gently. When she folded laundry, he placed socks beside her in his clumsy way. It was as if Maria carried a key no therapist or specialist had managed to forge, a key to Daniel's locked world. Richard felt torn between joy and envy. Why her? Why not him? But instead of anger, he felt gratitude, because for the first time, his son wasn't alone. Richard tried cautiously to join these moments. One evening, Maria sat cross-legged on the floor, building blocks with Daniel. Richard lowered himself beside them, stiff in his expensive suit. Daniel froze, his small hands hovering midair. Richard's chest tightened. Was he intruding? But then Maria smiled softly and slid a block toward Richard. "Senor Hale," she said gently, "help us." Richard picked it up, awkwardly adding to the tower. To his astonishment, Daniel glanced at him, not a fleeting flicker, but a gaze that lingered. It lasted only seconds, but for Richard, it was worth more than gold. Nights changed too. Daniel, once restless and sleepless, now calmed when Maria sang lullabies. Richard would stand at the doorway, hidden, watching his son drift off with his head on Maria's lap. The billionaire who once commanded nations now stood powerless, humbled, witnessing love heal where wealth had failed. Finally, one night, he entered instead of hiding. He sat beside Maria on the bed, resting a trembling hand near Daniel's. To his astonishment, Daniel didn't pull away. Instead, the boy's fingers crept over and rested lightly on his father's. Richard's vision blurred. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely to Maria. But whispers of scandal began to swirl. Staff muttered that the maid was replacing the billionaire in his own son's heart. Business partners snickered behind closed doors. Hale's fortune can't even buy his kids' love. Took a maid to do that. Richard burned with humiliation, but every time he saw Daniel smile faintly at Maria, the mockery lost its sting. For the first time, he didn't care what the world thought. His son's progress mattered more than his reputation. Still, Richard knew he had to make a choice: cling to pride or embrace the miracle Maria had brought into their lives. The breaking point came when a doctor visited for Daniel's routine evaluation. As the psychiatrist flipped through notes, Daniel startled everyone by leaving his toys, walking to Maria and wrapping his arms around her waist. The doctor's pen froze mid-air. "That," he said in awe, "is extraordinary." Richard felt his throat close, tears threatening to spill. In front of witnesses, in front of science itself, his son had shown trust, connection, love. And it wasn't bought with billions. It was freely given to a maid with nothing but patience and heart. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to hope. The following weeks tested Richard in ways he had never imagined. Boardroom crises suddenly seemed trivial compared to the fragile hope that had bloomed in his home. He found himself arriving earlier from work, desperate to witness Daniel's quiet victories, small things no one else would notice. A fleeting smile, a clumsy gesture of sharing, a glance that lingered 1 second longer than before. Maria never forced him. She only offered space, patience, and gentleness. Richard, a man used to demanding results, struggled to adapt. But Daniel's slow progress reminded him that love had no deadlines. For the first time, Richard learned to wait, yet the whispers outside grew louder. At charity galas, rivals sneered. Hale can conquer markets, but he can't handle his own child. Some even insinuated that Maria had bewitched Daniel, as if her bond were unnatural. Richard's temper flared, but he swallowed his rage. He returned home one night, fists clenched, to find Daniel sitting on the floor beside Maria, tracing patterns in the rug while she read softly. The sight melted his fury instantly. For Daniel, Maria wasn't staff. She was safety, warmth, stability, and Richard realized with a pang that he was the one needing to learn how to be those things too. One stormy night, as rain battered the mansion's windows, Daniel had his first major meltdown in weeks. Lightning cracked and he screamed, clutching his ears, rocking violently. Richard rushed forward, panicked. "Daniel, it's okay, son!" But his words only made the boy shriek louder. Maria, calm as ever, knelt beside him and began to hum. Her voice cut through the chaos like light in darkness. Slowly, Daniel's sobs softened. He pressed himself against her, trembling. Richard knelt too, helpless tears rolling down his face. For once, instead of feeling replaced, he let Maria's presence guide him and placed a protective arm around them both. The next morning, Richard knew things had changed forever. He asked Maria to sit with him in his office, a place no maid had ever been invited. "You've done what no one else could," he admitted, voice hoarse. "You've reached my son." Maria looked startled, shaking her head. "Senor Hale, it wasn't me." "It was him." He was ready. "I only gave him space." But Richard leaned forward, sincerity burning in his eyes. "Then stay. Not as staff, as family." "Daniel needs you!" "And so do I." His voice cracked on the last words, vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. Maria hesitated. Her life had been defined by service, not belonging. "I am just a maid," she whispered, almost ashamed. But Richard shook his head fiercely. "No, you're the reason my son is smiling for the first time in years. You are not just anything." His voice trembled, the mask of power stripped away. "I've built empires, Maria, but none of it matters if my son grows up in silence and loneliness. You brought light back into this house, please. Don't leave." For the first time, Maria saw not the billionaire, but a broken father begging for hope. She stayed, and with her, transformation rippled through the mansion. Daniel began to hum along with her songs. He stacked blocks, not just in lines, but in towers. One miraculous afternoon, he reached out, placed his small hand in Richard's, and whispered, barely audible, "Dad." The word shattered Richard. He dropped to his knees, sobbing openly, clutching his son with trembling arms. Maria watched, tears streaming down her face too. In that single word, years of silence dissolved. The empire outside could crumble, but inside those walls, Richard had finally won the only battle that mattered. News of Daniel's progress eventually spread. But this time, Richard didn't care about gossip. When journalists asked about the change, he stunned them by crediting Maria publicly. "The world taught me money solves everything," he declared at a press conference. But my son's first smile wasn't bought. It was given freely by someone who understood him better than anyone. The room went silent. For once, the billionaire titan didn't sound like a mogul. He sounded like a father. Rivals scoffed, but others were moved. Invitations poured in from autism foundations and advocacy groups who saw Richard's humility as revolutionary. Of course, not everyone approved. The board of his company warned him that his newfound openness might tarnish his reputation. "You can't be seen as weak," they argued. Richard silenced them with a single line: "If loving my son makes me weak, then I'll never be strong again." His words echoed like a thunderclap, a declaration no market could shake. For the first time in decades, Richard Hale wasn't defined by his billions, but by his heart. Maria, sitting quietly at home, didn't realize her simple kindness had changed not just a boy's life, but the course of an empire. Daniel continued to blossom. Though progress was slow, each step was monumental. He began using single words, then short phrases. One day, during a family dinner, a routine Maria introduced to bring normalcy, Daniel looked at Richard and said, "More, please." Richard nearly dropped his fork, joy exploding in his chest. Maria smiled knowingly, pride glowing in her eyes. The three of them laughed together, a sound so pure it seemed to banish the mansion's coldness forever. It wasn't perfection, it wasn't a cure, but it was love, and for Richard, it was enough. Years later, Richard would stand at a charity gala, not flaunting wealth, but speaking as a father. Beside him stood Maria, no longer maid, but family, and Daniel, taller now, still quiet, but radiant with growth. "7 nannies left," Richard told the hushed audience, his voice steady. "But one woman stayed, and because of her, my son walked, not just across the floor that first day, but into life itself." The crowd erupted in applause, some moved to tears. Richard reached for Maria's hand, then his son's, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly rich.